Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're tackling something that might literally change how you look at your own biology. We usually think of life purely in terms of physical stuff, right? Matter and energy. Blood pumping, muscles moving, calories burning. But what if biological life is governed by something way more abstract? Today, we're unpacking a fascinating paper by Dr. Mesed Tez titled The Role of Information in Biological Systems. And we're going to mix in some deep philosophical concepts to show you that there is a massive missing ingredient in how we understand life and stability.
Okay, let's dive into this. What actually separates living things from non-living things? It sounds super simple. If you reach back to high school biology, you might think about cells or reproduction, maybe metabolism. But the distinction between a living, breathing human and, say, a rock isn't just about the physical atoms we're made of. As we'll see, it's fundamentally about how we interact with the world around us.
To set the stage here, think about what cybernetics pioneer Norbert Wiener argued. He believed that materialism, the idea that only physical matter matters, is just entirely incomplete without information. And this is really our core premise today. Matter and energy are just the hardware. Information is the invisible software that actually makes life happen. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll quickly cover the definition of stability, the limits of energy, reality as an active process, the shift from data to information, and finally, the era of homeoinformation.
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the definition of stability, and what we might call the old view of biology.
This old view traces way back to the 1800s with Claude Bernard's idea of a stable internal environment, which Walter Cannon mapped out later on. On one side, we have homeostasis. You're definitely familiar with this one. It's your body's short-term stability mechanism. Get too hot, you sweat to cool down. Classic negative feedback loop using physical matter and energy. On the flip side, we have homeorhesis. This is about coordinated, long-term developmental changes. Think about the massive, highly controlled alterations a mother's body undergoes during pregnancy to support a child while still maintaining overall stability. Both of these concepts are absolutely crucial, but notice how they are entirely rooted in physical parameters. We're talking temperature, pH balances, and hormones.
Which brings us to Section 2, the limits of energy, and why we need to move beyond the basics.
Because, while homeostasis and homeorhesis are fantastic for a single mammal, they start to fall completely short when you look at highly complex biological events. Take epidemiology and the COVID-19 pandemic, for example. You simply cannot fully understand the expansion or contraction of a pandemic just by looking at basic energy feedback loops. As the source material points out, a pandemic relies on a massive web of external variables. We're talking host behavior, population immune status, incredibly complex viral mutations. These interactions go way, way beyond simple matter-energy mechanisms. There is a missing layer here governing how living systems adapt.
So let's pivot slightly to Section 3, reality as an active process, exploring Whitehead's framework. To bridge this gap, we're looking to Alfred North Whitehead's process philosophy. He pushed back hard against the traditional assumption that the world is just made up of stubborn, static chunks of matter. Instead, he introduced what he called actual occasions. Basically, reality is made of dynamic drops of experience. In process thought, even a subatomic particle isn't just a static thing. It's a constant, ongoing process defined entirely by its relational environment and the data it takes in. Nothing exists in a vacuum. To exist is literally to be open to interaction.
Now, what's really interesting here is this funnel shape of concretions. Imagine an entity presented with vast amounts of raw data from its environment, what Whitehead called conformal feelings. As that data moves through the process, it gets compared, sorted, and narrowed down until the entity makes a decision about how to actualize itself. It is literally funneling raw, chaotic input into a concrete state of being.
But how does this apply to us? Well, Whitehead differentiates between an aggregational society, like a rock, which is just a random collection of atoms with zero unified central experience, and a compound individual, like a human being. In living things, sensory data from billions of tiny cellular processes funnels inwards. It combines, it builds, and eventually it centralizes into what we call the self. This incredibly rich unification of data is exactly what creates our consciousness. A rock doesn't do this. A living organism absolutely does.
Moving right along to Section 4, from data to information, the true hallmark of life.
Let's bring this philosophy directly back to modern biology. To truly grasp this unique ability to funnel inputs, we have to distinguish between data and information. Raw data is just unprocessed facts.
It's like meaningless numbers on a giant spreadsheet, or the raw light waves hitting your eyes right now. It doesn't mean anything on its own. Actionable information, however, is that data once it's been processed and interpreted. It's the beautifully formatted business chart. In fact, right now, your eyes are taking in the raw visual data of this explainer, and your brain is actively converting it into the information you are currently learning. A non-living system simply can't do this. Only living beings have the sophisticated mechanisms required to process raw data into actual information. Let's see how this builds a four-step biological pipeline. First, living things collect data using senses, sight, smell, or specialized leaf structures for a plant. Second, they store it in neural or chemical networks. Third, they process and interpret that data. And finally, they act on it to adapt and survive. This data-to-information pipeline is the fundamental driver of biological survival. It is quite literally just as critical to your life as breathing oxygen or getting enough calories.
And that brings us to our final stop, Section 5, the era of homeoinformation, a totally new paradigm.
We've seen that the old views focus heavily on matter, while reality itself is actually a dynamic process of data integration. And this leads us to the crucial point proposed by Dr. Tez, homeoinformation. This is the overarching principle that organisms maintain stability and adapt not just by sweating or altering protein synthesis, but through the continuous processing and integration of information. Biological regulation goes far, far beyond physical homeostasis. Information isn't just a fun, abstract idea, it is a fundamental, functional entity right alongside matter and energy that directly governs the dynamic, adaptive processes of your life.
I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought. If life, right down to the cellular level, is fundamentally defined by how we intake data and process it into actionable information to maintain our stability, how is the relentless flood of raw data in our modern digital age changing our biology? Are we successfully adapting, or is our homeoinformation system becoming completely overloaded? It's definitely something to think about the next time you find yourself endlessly scrolling through a feed. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.